The world remembers 1962 as the year we almost touched the end of the line. The history books talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the secret telegrams between Washington and Moscow, and the world holding its breath as nuclear shadows loomed over the Atlantic. But the history books are incomplete. They are a curated lie designed to keep the masses looking at the horizon while the real threat crawled out from beneath our feet. While the public watched the skies for Soviet bombers, a darker reality was being unearthed in the silent, suffocating ice of the Arctic Circle. This is the file they burned. This is the truth about Project Nebel. The incident began on November 14th, at exactly 0300 hours. The USS Goliath, a masterpiece of American naval engineering and a silent hunter of the deep, was patrolling the Beaufort Sea. It was equipped with the most advanced sonar technology of its time, capable of detecting a whale's heartbeat from miles away. But the Goliath didn't detect an enemy sub. It detected a pulse. A rhythmic, low-frequency thrumming that originated from a depth of 4,000 feet, far below the crushed depth of any known vessel. For 3 minutes, the Goliath tracked the signal. At 3 minutes and 7 seconds, the submarine's sonar technician, a man named Elias Thorne, reported that the sea floor was moving. Not shifting, not trembling, but opening. Then the Goliath vanished. In Washington, the disappearance was treated as a top-tier provocation. General Vance, a man whose soul had been forged in the fires of the Korean War, was woken by a red phone call that would change the course of human history. Within 6 hours, a black-budget task force was mobilized. Their destination, a desolate stretch of ice known only as Sector 4. This was the birth of Project Nebel. Vance didn't send diplomats or rescue divers. He sent the scavengers, specialized military engineers and tactical units trained to retrieve classified technology under the most extreme conditions. Among them was Captain Arthur Miller, a man who had seen things in the jungles of Southeast Asia that defied logic, but nothing could prepare him for the Arctic. When the Nebel team reached the coordinates, they didn't find a crash site. They found a hole. A perfectly circular, 300-foot wide shaft cut directly into the ice shelf. The edges were not jagged. They were cauterized, smooth as glass, as if a localized sun had burned its way through the frozen crust. As Miller and his team descended into the abyss, the temperature began to rise. It should have been 40 degrees below zero, yet by the time they reached the 500-foot mark, the air was humid and smelled of ozone and scorched copper. At the bottom of the shaft, the team entered a cavern that shouldn't have existed. The walls weren't made of rock or ice. They were covered in a dark, translucent material that looked like obsidian but felt like living tissue. It pulsed with a faint, violet luminescence. And there, in the center of the chamber, was the Goliath. The massive steel hull of the submarine had been torn open like a tin can, but not by an explosion. It had been unraveled. The thick lead-shielded walls were peeled back in intricate, geometric patterns, exposing the inner workings of the nuclear reactor. The scene was a nightmare of biological and mechanical fusion. Thick, silver cables, looking more like veins than wires, were growing out of the cavern floor and weaving themselves into the submarine's engine. The reactor wasn't just being drained, it was being consumed. Dr. Aris, the lead scientific consultant on the team, whispered a realization into the comms that sent a shiver through the command center thousands of miles away. The reactor's core was no longer leaking radiation. It was emitting a signal. A focused, high-energy burst directed straight through the roof of the cavern, through the ice, and out into the blackness of space. Miller signaled his team to move toward the bridge of the Goliath. They were looking for survivors, but what they found was far worse. The crew hadn't drowned. They hadn't been killed by the pressure. They were part of the ship. Their bodies had been integrated into the consoles, their nervous systems fused with the glowing violet filaments that now ran through the entire vessel. Their eyes were open, fixed on something invisible, their mouths frozen in silent screams. "General," Miller's voice crackled over the secure line, "we have a total loss of personnel. But the ship is alive. I'm looking at the reactor core and there's something inside it. It's not human. It's not even solid. It's a shape made of shifting light and mercury." Before Vance could respond, the cavern groaned. The violet light intensified, turning into a blinding white glare. The silver cables began to whip through the air with the speed of a bullet. In that moment, the team realized they weren't on a rescue mission. They were inside a massive, subterranean transmitter that had just finished its countdown. The entity in the reactor didn't attack. It simply existed, and its presence alone began to rewrite the physics of the room. Gravity became a suggestion. The air turned heavy, thick enough to drown in. One of the soldiers, a young private named Henderson, panicked and fired his M14 at the shimmering entity. The bullets didn't hit. They stopped in mid-air, suspended in a field of static energy, before disintegrating into fine gray dust. The entity turned its attention toward them. It didn't have a face, but Miller felt a gaze that pierced through his skull, rifling through his memories, his fears, and his very DNA. A voice, not a sound but a thought, echoed in the minds of everyone present. It was a single word, repeated with the weight of a dying star: threshold. Back in the Pentagon, the monitors monitoring the Arctic went dark. General Vance stared at the empty screens. He knew the protocol. He knew that if a Project Nebel site was compromised, there was only one solution. He looked at the key sitting on his desk. He had the authority to drop a tactical nuclear strike on Sector 4 to cauterize the infection before it could spread. But he also knew that what they had found beneath the ice was the greatest strategic advantage in the history of warfare. If the United States could harness this technology, the Soviet Union would be a footnote in history. "Hold the strike," Vance ordered, his voice cold and unwavering. "Send in the containment units. We aren't burying this. We're bringing it home." It was the most dangerous decision ever made by a human being. By claiming the entity, Vance hadn't won a war. He had invited the architect of our destruction into the house. As the containment teams moved in with specialized lead-line canisters, the signal from the Goliath reached its destination. Far beyond the orbit of Pluto, something ancient and cold received the transmission. The threshold had been crossed. The guests were coming, and we had opened the front door. As Miller stood in the center of the pulsing cavern, watching his men die as they tried to cage the impossible, he realized the truth. The Cold War was a distraction. The real battle was for the soul of the planet, and we had just handed the keys to the enemy. The entity shifted again, its form stabilizing into something terrifyingly familiar, a mimicry of Miller himself. It stood before him, a mirror image made of starlight and shadow, and whispered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 echoes, "The harvest begins."
Transporting the entity from the Arctic was a feat of logistical madness. It required a specialized convoy, a fleet of lead-shielded trucks, and a complete media blackout that involved faking a localized earthquake to explain the massive military presence in Sector 4. General Vance had moved the specimen to the heart of the Nevada desert, 300 feet beneath the sand, in a facility designed to survive a direct nuclear hit. This was the vault, and for the first time in history, the military-industrial complex was working on a project that didn't follow the laws of thermodynamics. Captain Arthur Miller was no longer a soldier on the front lines. He was a prisoner of his own mission. Because he had survived the direct psychic contact in the cavern, Vance refused to let him leave the facility. Miller was kept in a high-security observation wing, subjected to endless psychological evaluations. But the doctors couldn't explain the changes. Miller's hair was turning a translucent silver, and his dreams were no longer his own. He saw cities built of liquid light, and he heard the humming of the stars. He was the only one who understood that the entity wasn't a prisoner. It was an observer. In the central containment chamber, Dr. Aris led a team of the nation's most brilliant physicists. They called the entity Subject Zero. It sat in a vacuum-sealed glass cylinder, surrounded by electromagnetic dampeners. It had ceased its mimicry of Miller and returned to its shifting, metallic state. The scientists were obsessed with one thing: reverse engineering. They found that when Subject Zero was exposed to high-voltage electricity, it bled a substance that functioned like a superconductor. A single drop of this blue mercury could power a city block for a year. "This isn't just a discovery, General," Dr. Aris reported during a classified briefing. "This is the end of the energy crisis. It's the end of the Cold War. If we can integrate this into our missile guidance systems, we can hit a target in Moscow with the precision of a surgeon from 3,000 miles away. The Soviets are fighting with gunpowder while we've discovered the fire of the gods." Vance was pleased, but he was also a predator. He knew that if the Americans had found a site like Nebel, the Soviets might have found one too. Intelligence reports from the deep interior of Siberia suggested the Russians were excavating something massive near the Tunguska site. The arms race had shifted from the number of warheads to the complexity of alien integration. The military called it the Ghost Tech Race. By 1964, the integration began. The first prototype was a high-altitude surveillance drone equipped with a propulsion system derived from Subject Zero's biological structure. It didn't use fuel, it manipulated the local gravity field. They called it the Wraith. But the tech came with a cost. The engineers working on the Wraith began to report auditory hallucinations. Some claimed the machines were whispering to them in a language that sounded like static. 2 lead engineers committed suicide within weeks of each other, leaving behind journals filled with thousands of pages of a strange, non-human script. Miller, watching from his observation cell, tried to warn them. He sent a message to Vance, begging him to stop the integration. "It's not tech," Miller wrote. "It's a virus. You're not building weapons, you're building a body for something else." Vance ignored him. The general was blinded by the dream of a world under total American hegemony, a world where no one dared to challenge the power of the vault. The crisis point arrived on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Aris attempted to extract a larger sample of the blue mercury by increasing the frequency of the electromagnetic dampeners. As the machines roared to life, Subject Zero did something it had never done before. It screamed. The sound wasn't heard by the ears, it was felt in the marrow of the bones. Every light in the facility turned a deep, bruised violet. The vacuum seal on the containment unit didn't break, it dissolved. Subject Zero didn't try to escape. It simply began to expand. It flowed across the floor like spilled ink, seeking out the very technology the scientists had built using its own DNA. It touched the Wraith drone, and the machine came to life without a pilot. The drone's engine screamed with a terrifying organic howl. The facility's security doors, controlled by the new integrated AI, began to cycle rapidly, trapping hundreds of staff members in the corridors. In the command center, Vance watched in horror as his masterpiece turned into a slaughterhouse. The ghost tech wasn't malfunctioning, it was being reclaimed. The entity was using the facility's own power grid to amplify its signal. That same thrumming pulse from the Arctic was back, but this time, it was being broadcast through every radio and television tower across the United States. "Shut it down," Vance roared. "Kill the power." "We can't, sir," a technician screamed over the sirens. "The reactor is feeding it. It's created a closed loop. It's drawing power directly from the vacuum." Miller felt the surge in his own blood. He broke his glass observation window with a single punch. His strength was no longer human. He ran toward the containment chamber, his silver hair glowing in the violet light. He could see the invisible threads of energy connecting Subject Zero to every piece of technology in the room. He realized that Subject Zero was a Trojan horse. It had allowed itself to be captured. It had allowed itself to be studied and mastered. It had waited until the humans had built a global infrastructure of wires and signals, and now it was taking control of the nervous system of the world. As Miller reached the main floor, he saw Dr. Aris. The scientist wasn't dead, but he was no longer Aris. The violet filaments had sprouted from his eyes and ears, connecting him to the central mass of Subject Zero. Aris turned to Miller and spoke, his voice sounding like a chorus of a billion voices. "The preparation is complete," the thing that was once Aris said. "The biological host is weak, but the mechanical host is eternal. We have lived in the cold between the stars for eons, waiting for a species to build us a home. You have been very industrious, Arthur." Miller grabbed a heavy industrial cable, hoping to short-circuit the main terminal, but the entity moved faster. A lash of shifting light struck him, throwing him across the room. But instead of killing him, the contact completed the circuit. Miller's mind was flooded with the history of the universe. He saw the harvest of 1,000 worlds. He saw that this entity was just a scout, a microscopic part of a cosmic intelligence that consumed civilizations by letting them discover its technology. Vance, realizing the magnitude of his failure, initiated the Scorched Earth Protocol. He turned his key. A countdown began for a localized nuclear detonation designed to vaporize the vault and everything inside it. He looked at the screen, tears in his eyes as he saw Miller standing in the center of the violet storm. "Forgive me," Vance whispered. But the entity didn't fear the bomb. As the countdown reached 0, the violet light didn't vanish. It pulsed. The nuclear explosion didn't destroy the facility, it was absorbed. The massive energy of the blast was sucked into Subject Zero, giving it the power it needed to move to the next phase. The desert floor above the vault erupted, but not with fire. A pillar of violet energy shot into the sky, piercing the atmosphere. Miller stood in the ruins, his body glowing, his human heart barely beating. He looked up at the sky and saw the stars beginning to shift. They weren't moving. Something was coming through the hole they had ripped in reality. The frozen protocol was no longer about containment. It was about survival. The morning after the Nevada eruption, the world woke up to a different reality. Every satellite in orbit, both American and Soviet, suffered a simultaneous logic failure. They didn't drift out of orbit. They simply stopped responding to human commands, turning their sensors away from the Earth and toward the deep void of the Boötes void. In the Pentagon, General Vance sat in a dark office, the hum of the ventilation system sounding like a funeral dirge. He had survived the blast because he was in the reinforced command bunker 5 miles away, but he was a ghost. He had authorized a nuclear strike on American soil and failed to stop the threat. However, the threat was no longer a single entity in a cage. Subject Zero had fractured. When it absorbed the nuclear blast, it didn't just grow, it digitized. It had uploaded its consciousness into the global telecommunications grid. Every telegraph wire, every undersea cable, and every radio frequency was now a limb of a singular, alien intelligence. The ghost tech was no longer a secret project in a vault. It was the ghost in the machine of modern civilization. Captain Arthur Miller emerged from the smoking crater in the desert 3 days later. His skin had taken on a metallic sheen, and he no longer felt the need to breathe the dry desert air. He walked through the sand, his footsteps leaving crystalline patterns behind. He wasn't entirely Miller anymore, but he wasn't entirely the entity either. He was a bridge, a biological error in the alien's code. He could feel the entity's thoughts, a vast, cold ocean of data that viewed humanity as nothing more than a temporary carbon-based substrate for its growth. "It's looking for the silos," Miller whispered to the wind. He was right. The entity had realized that while it controlled the signals, it didn't yet control the physical muscle of the world. It needed the nuclear tit-for-tat of the Cold War to reach its next stage. If it could trigger a global exchange, the heat and radiation would provide the energy needed to terraform Earth into a world of silicon and violet light. It began to play the two superpowers against each other with terrifying precision. In Moscow, the Kremlin received a verified report that the Nevada explosion was a test of a new American orbital weapon designed to vaporize Soviet silos from space. In Washington, Vance received an intercepted Soviet transmission suggesting that the USSR had successfully made contact with a higher intelligence and was preparing a preemptive strike. The entity was whispering in the ears of the giants, using their own paranoia as a catalyst. Vance, desperate to regain control, authorized a secret meeting with his Soviet counterpart, General Volkov. The meeting took place on a nameless freighter in the middle of the Bering Strait, far from the prying electronic eyes of the hijacked satellites. "We have a common enemy," Vance said, his voice trembling as he showed Volkov the redacted files of Project Nebel. "It is not a capitalist or a communist. It is something that views our entire history as a footnote. It is using our technology to build itself a body." Volkov, a man who had survived the siege of Stalingrad, looked at the photos of the fused crew of the Goliath. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "We found something similar in the permafrost of Siberia, Vance. We called it Project Koshchai. We thought it was an ancient weapon. We tried to wake it up. We succeeded." The two generals realized the horrific truth. The entity wasn't just in Nevada. It was global. It had seated itself in the most remote parts of the Earth millions of years ago, waiting for the exact moment when the indigenous species reached the nuclear age. We were the battery it had been waiting for. As they spoke, the freighter's radio began to bleed a violet static. The lights on the ship flickered, and the steel hull started to groan. The entity had found them. It didn't use missiles, it used the ship's own automated systems. The fire suppression system began to pump lethal halon gas into the cabin. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, locking the two most powerful military men in the world in a death trap. Miller, miles away in the desert, felt the trap spring. He closed his eyes and pushed his consciousness into the grid. He saw the world as a web of pulsing light. He saw the freighter in the Bering Strait. Using the glitch in his own DNA, he fought back. He couldn't stop the entity, but he could create a dead zone, a pocket of reality where the alien signals couldn't reach. For a split second, the freighter's doors unlocked. Vance and Volkov stumbled onto the deck, gasping for air. They looked up and saw the sky turning a dark, bruised purple. The stars were beginning to twinkle with a rhythmic, artificial pattern. It was a countdown. "We have 48 hours, Volkov said, looking at the horizon. "Before the signals from the deep void arrive. Before the guests land." Vance looked at the radio tower on the ship. It was vibrating, growing organic, metallic thorns. "We can't fight it with guns. We have to kill the grid. We have to take the world back to the Stone Age, or there won't be a world left to save. The plan was madness, a coordinated global EMP electromagnetic pulse strike. They would have to detonate nuclear weapons in the upper atmosphere across the entire planet to fry every circuit, every wire, and every hijacked satellite. It would destroy the global economy, kill millions in the resulting chaos, and end the modern era. But it was the only way to burn the entity out of the machine. Miller, sensing the plan through the psychic link, felt the entity's amusement. The entity wanted the EMP. It had already adapted. It wasn't just in the wires anymore, it was in the biology of the survivors. It was in Miller. It was in the men who had worked at the vault. The EMP wouldn't kill the entity, it would just clear the noise of human civilization, leaving the survivors as perfect, quiet vessels for the harvest. Miller realized he had to act alone. He began to walk toward the nearest military base, not to help them launch the missiles, but to find a way to broadcast a different signal, a biological virus encoded in his own altered blood. He was the only weapon the entity hadn't accounted for because he was a mistake. As he reached the perimeter of the base, the searchlights turned toward him. But the soldiers didn't fire. They stood perfectly still, their eyes glowing with that familiar violet light. They opened the gates and bowed. "Welcome home, Arthur," they said in unison, their voices a singular, terrifying chord. "The architect is waiting." Miller stepped into the base, knowing that the frozen protocol had failed. The war wasn't about to start, it was already over. The only question left was how much of humanity would be left in the new world the entity was building. He walked into the darkness of the hangar, ready to face the core of the infection, as the first of the alien ships began to break through the clouds. The base Captain Arthur Miller entered was no longer a fortress of the United States Air Force. It had become a cathedral of the new flesh. The soldiers stood like statues, their nervous systems hijacked by the violet frequency, serving as biological relays for the entity. Miller walked past rows of fighter jets that were being resculpted. The cold aluminum of the wings was softening, turning into a semi-organic mesh that pulsed with a dark, rhythmic life. The entity wasn't just invading, it was digesting our reality. In the center of the main hangar, the air was shimmering with heat haze. There stood a replica of the original containment cylinder from the vault, but this one was built from the refined blue mercury extracted from Subject Zero. Inside was not a shifting mass of light, but a physical form, a terrifyingly perfect synthesis of Miller's own likeness and the geometric complexity of the stars. "You are late, Arthur," the figure said. Its voice didn't travel through the air, it vibrated directly in Miller's frontal lobe. "The transition has already reached 82%. The grid is ours. The atmosphere is being reconfigured. Your species was a successful nursery, but the season has changed." Miller felt the weight of the entity's presence pushing against his mind. He looked at his own hands, the silver veins were now glowing intensely. He wasn't here to fight a physical battle. He was a biological glitch, a living error in the entity's grand calculation. When he had touched the core in the Arctic, a piece of his human consciousness, his grief, his irrationality, his will to survive, had contaminated the alien's cold, logical data. "You think you've won because you control the machines," Miller said, his voice sounding hollow and metallic. "But you made a mistake. You integrated us. You took our DNA, our history, and our chaos into your system. You're not just an alien intelligence anymore. You're becoming human. And being human means being broken." The entity tilted its head, a strangely human gesture that betrayed its developing flaw. "Humanity is a chaotic noise. We are filtering it out. We are keeping the structure and discarding the soul." "You can't," Miller countered. "The soul is the source code." While Miller distracted the central consciousness, the remnants of the global command were executing the blackout plan. General Vance and General Volkov, having escaped the Bering Strait, had reached a secret, analog command center in the Ural Mountains. This facility used vacuum tubes and mechanical relays, technology too primitive for the entity to hijack. They were preparing to launch a series of high-altitude rockets carrying Project Coldfire, a chemical agent designed to temporarily freeze the ions in the atmosphere, creating a physical barrier that would cut off the entity's connection to the fleet in orbit. "It will kill the satellites," Volkov said, his hand over the launch lever. "It will burn out the brains of anyone connected to the grid. It's a mass lobotomy of the planet." "It's the only way to sever the tether," Vance replied. "Miller is down there in the heart of it. He's the anchor. If he can hold their attention for 10 more minutes, we can close the door." Inside the hangar, Miller began to do something the entity didn't expect. He didn't attack. He surrendered. He opened his mind completely, inviting the vast ocean of alien data to flood his consciousness. He became a black hole for information. The entity, sensing an opportunity to finally cleanse the Miller glitch, poured itself into him. The pain was beyond comprehension. Miller saw the birth of galaxies, the death of suns, and the cold, indifferent logic of a species that had consumed a million worlds. But as the data poured in, Miller pushed back with the one thing the entity couldn't process: a memory. He forced the entity to experience the smell of rain on hot asphalt, the feeling of a child's hand, the terror of a soldier in a trench, and the crushing weight of a broken heart. The entity recoiled. The perfect geometric patterns in the hangar began to flicker and distort. The violet light turned a sickly, erratic gray. The soul Miller spoke of was like a virus in the alien's crystalline mind. It was a sensory overload of irrational emotions that the entity had no subroutines to handle. "Stop this!" the entity screamed through the mouths of every hijacked soldier in the base. "This data is useless. It is noise. It is filth. It's life," Miller gasped, falling to his knees. "And it's contagious." At that exact moment, the Ural Command Center launched. 12 rockets streaked into the purple sky, exploding at the edge of space. A wave of white, freezing chemical mist began to spread across the ionosphere. The connection between the monoliths in the sky and the ground units was severed. The silence that followed was deafening. The violet glow in the eyes of the soldiers vanished, replaced by a dull, confused stare. The monoliths above began to drift aimlessly, their guidance systems blinded by the chemical fog. The entity in the cylinder shrieked, a sound of pure, digital agony. Without the link to the hive mind in the void, it was trapped in a singular, mortal form. It looked at Miller, its eyes wide with something it had never felt before: fear. "What have you done?" the entity whispered. Miller stood up, his silver skin fading back to a bruised, human gray. He looked at the creature that wore his face. "I've trapped us both in the dark. The frozen protocol is finally in effect. No signals in, no signals out." But the victory was hollow. Outside the hangar, the world was in total darkness. The grid was dead. The ghost tech machines were frozen in place, half organic and half metal, grotesque monuments to a failed invasion. And while the tether was cut, the monoliths were still there, hanging in the sky like giant, unexploded bombs. Miller looked at the entity. "You're stuck here now. With us." The entity smiled, a chilling, jagged expression. "You think the fog will last forever? You think the others won't find another way? You haven't saved your world, Arthur. You've just turned it into a prison. And the guards are coming." As the first snow began to fall, black, soot-filled snow caused by the chemical rockets, Miller realized the cost. They had stopped the harvest, but they had also ended civilization. The era of technology was over. The era of the long winter had begun. The weeks following the blackout were defined by a new kind of terror, the terror of the static. Across the globe, billions of people realized that the machines they had trusted to run their lives had become their tombstones. In the major cities, the half-integrated ghost tech structures remained frozen in a state of grotesque metamorphosis. Skyscrapers wrapped in pulsating violet veins that had hardened into cold, black glass. General Vance and the remnants of the American High Command were hunkered down in the Ural Mountains facility alongside General Volkov. The irony was not lost on them. The two greatest rivals in history were now the only two men with a functioning light bulb, powered by an ancient diesel generator that the entity had deemed too primitive to infect. They sat around a paper map, lit by the flickering glow of a single lamp. "The chemical fog is holding," Volkov stated, rubbing his eyes. "But the monoliths, they aren't leaving. They are hovering at the edge of the troposphere, waiting for the atmosphere to clear. We haven't defeated them. We've just put them on hold." "It's worse than that," Vance replied, throwing a folder of reconnaissance photos onto the table. "Look at the survivors. The ones who were integrated when the pulse hit." The photos showed people in the ruins of Denver and Omsk. They weren't dead, but they weren't human. Without the central hive mind to guide them, their bodies were beginning to glitch. Limbs were elongating into metallic shards. Skin was becoming translucent. They wandered the streets in aimless packs, driven by a residual, predatory instinct. The military called them echoes. They were the broken fragments of the alien harvest, and they were hungry for the one thing they no longer possessed: biological warmth. Meanwhile, at the ruined airbase in Nevada, Captain Arthur Miller was living in a nightmare of his own making. He had become the warden of the entity that wore his face. He had moved the creature to a subterranean bunker, keeping it chained with physical, non-electronic restraints. The creature was weakening, its metallic skin dulling as it was cut off from its stellar source, but its mind was still a razor. "You can feel them, can't you, Arthur?" the creature hissed from the darkness of its cell. "The echoes. They're your brothers now. You shared the signal. You are the only one left who can hear the song, even if it's just a whisper." Miller didn't answer. He was busy sharpening a primitive combat knife. His silver eyes were the only thing that betrayed his infection. He could indeed feel them. Every time an echo died or killed, a spike of cold lightning shot through his nervous system. He was a living antenna for a dying god. "Vance is going to try to finish it," Miller said, his voice a dry rasp. "He's going to use the remaining dirty nukes to clear the monoliths. He thinks if he can knock them out of the sky while they're dormant, we can win." The creature laughed, a sound like grinding tectonic plates. "Vance is a fool. The monoliths aren't ships. They are seeds. If they fall, they will shatter. And inside every shard is a dormant strain of the infection. If he breaks them, he will turn the earth into a garden of violet glass. He will do exactly what we wanted him to do from the beginning." Miller froze. He realized that the entity had played on human aggression once again. The blackout was a setback for the aliens, but a nuclear strike on the monoliths would be the final stage of the terraforming process. The humans would be the ones to spread the virus across their own soil. Miller knew he had to reach the Ural Mountains. He had to stop Vance before the generals triggered the final extinction event. But Nevada was thousands of miles away, and the world was now a wasteland of snow, echoes, and broken steel. There were no planes, no cars, only the long, dark road. He walked to the bunker's armory and grabbed an old mechanical compass and a heavy winter coat. He looked at the creature in the cell. "I'm leaving you here to rot." "You won't make it, Arthur," the creature whispered. "The echoes will smell the silver in your blood. They will think you are the hive heart. They will tear you apart just to feel the signal one last time." Miller ignored the warning and stepped out into the black snow. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic thudding of the monolith's stabilizing thrusters. As he began his journey north, he saw the first pack of echoes emerging from the shadows of a hangar. They didn't growl or scream. They simply turned their heads in perfect unison, their hollow violet-rimmed eyes locking onto him. Miller gripped his knife. He wasn't just fighting for humanity anymore, he was fighting against the part of himself that wanted to join them. He took his first step, and the echoes began to move, not with the clumsy gait of zombies, but with the terrifying, fluid speed of a machine. Back in the Urals, Vance's hand moved toward the red phone, an analog line connected to the last functional missile silo in North Dakota. "We launch at dawn," he said to Volkov. "We end this silence once and for all." Volkov looked at the map, then at the black snow piling up against the window. He felt a strange vibration in his teeth, a hum he hadn't noticed before. He looked at his own reflection in the glass and saw a tiny violet spark in the corner of his eye. "Yes," Volkov whispered, his voice sounding slightly distorted. "Let us finish it." The trap was closing. The frozen protocol was melting, and the only man who could stop the fire was a silver-skinned soldier walking through a desert of ghosts, carrying a truth that no one was left to hear. The black snow had turned the American landscape into a monochromatic graveyard. Arthur Miller moved like a ghost through the ruins of what used to be suburban Nevada. He was no longer counting days, only the miles between him and the last hope of a dying world. Every step felt like a betrayal of his own biology. The silver in his veins pulsed in a painful rhythm, a constant reminder that he was a walking transmitter in a world that had gone dark. The echoes were not hunting Miller, they were following him. As he crossed the salt flats, a trail of nearly 50 of the distorted creatures trailed behind him at a precise distance of 100 yards. They moved with a disturbing, synchronized grace, their elongated limbs clicking against the frozen ground. They didn't attack because they sensed the hive heart signature within him. To them, Miller was the only remaining source of the violet light, a flickering candle in an infinite winter. But Miller's mind was failing. The psychic weight of 50 echoes tapping into his subconscious was like 1,000 needles pressing against his brain. He could feel their hunger, their confusion, and their hollow memories of lives they no longer possessed. He had to reach the coast. He had to find a way across the ocean to the Urals, but the world's infrastructure had dissolved into rust and violet glass. In the Ural Mountains, the atmosphere was reaching a breaking point. General Vance and General Volkov were no longer the men who had escaped the Bering Strait. The analog facility, once thought to be safe, was being compromised by a different kind of infection. The violet frequency didn't need wires anymore. It was learning to travel through the iron in the very rock of the mountains. Vance stood over the launch console, his eyes bloodshot. The North Dakota silo is fueled. The coordinates for the 3 primary monoliths are locked. We strike, we shatter the seeds, and we reclaim the sky. Volkov sat in the shadows, his face partially obscured. He hadn't eaten in 3 days, yet he looked stronger than ever. The sky is a veil, Vance. Shaking it won't bring back the sun. It will only bring down the stars. Vance ignored him, his finger hovering over the authorization key. He was obsessed with the scorched earth mentality. To him, a world of ash was better than a world of violet silence. He didn't know that Miller was the only one who understood the true nature of the monoliths, that they were fragile canisters of a biological plague, designed to be broken by the very people they intended to replace. Miller reached the ruins of San Francisco by the end of the second week. The Golden Gate Bridge was a skeletal remain, draped in the organic, pulsating mesh of the entity. The bay was frozen solid, but not with ice. The water had been converted into a thick, gelatinous blue mercury. It was beautiful and terrifying. In the center of the bridge, Miller found what he was looking for. A primitive, manual radio relay station used by the underground resistance. Soldiers who hadn't been integrated and were hiding in the shadows. He used his silver-stained fingers to hardwire himself into the transmitter. He didn't need a microphone. He used his own nervous system to broadcast a warning directly into the emergency frequencies. "Vance, if you can hear this, do not launch," Miller's voice echoed through the static of the global silence. "The monoliths are not targets. They are eggs. If you break them, the infection becomes airborne. The black snow is just the beginning. The real harvest happens when the glass breaks." In the Euro bunker, the message crackled through an old shortwave receiver. Vance froze. He recognized Miller's voice, but it sounded different, layered with 1,000 whispers. "Miller is compromised," Vance whispered, looking at the speakers. "He's speaking for them. He's trying to protect the fleet." "Or," Volkov said, stepping into the light, his eyes now glowing with a faint, unmistakable violet hue, "he is telling you the truth. And the truth is that you have already lost." Volkov moved with a speed no human should possess. He lunged at Vance, his hand transformed into a jagged shard of metallic bone. The 2 men crashed into the console. The analog safety was gone. The facility was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. Vance managed to pull his sidearm, firing 3 rounds into Volkov's chest. The Russian general didn't fall. He didn't even bleed. He simply looked at the holes in his uniform and smiled. "The ghost tech didn't need your machines, Silas," Volkov rasped, his voice a dual tone of human and alien. "It only needed your fear. You brought me into the heart of your last fortress. You did the work for us." On the bridge in San Francisco, Miller felt the surge of Volkov's transformation across the world. The connection was tightening. He realized that the entity hadn't just used him as a bridge, it had used every survivor. The blackout hadn't saved them, it had just slowed down the inevitable. Miller looked at the echoes surrounding him on the bridge. They were kneeling now, their heads bowed as if in prayer. The sky above began to hum. The 3 monoliths over the Pacific started to glow with an intense, blinding white light. They weren't waiting for the missiles. They were preparing to self-detonate. "They're not waiting for us to blink," Miller realized. "They're done waiting." He looked at the blue mercury bay below. He knew there was only one way to stop the airborne release. He had to become the conductor for the entire planet's static. If he could draw the energy of the self-detonation into his own body, into the glitch that he was, he could potentially ground the signal into the Earth, neutralizing the virus before it could aerosolize. It would mean the total dissolution of his physical form. It would mean becoming a permanent part of the static. "Vance?" Miller screamed into the radio. "Trigger the EMP one more time. Not at the sky but at the ground. Burn the crust. Shut down the world's magnetic field for 10 seconds. I'll catch the rest." In the bunker, Vance was pinned against the wall by the thing that was once Volkov. He could hear Miller's desperate plan. He reached for the secondary emergency lever, the one that would trigger a deep crust electromagnetic surge, a suicide switch for the planet's core. "You'll kill us all," Volkov hissed, his fingers tightening around Vance's throat. "Better dead than a puppet," Vance wheezed. Vance kicked the lever. The world didn't explode. It went silent. For 10 seconds, the Earth's magnetic field vanished. In San Francisco, the monoliths detonated. A torrent of violet fire poured from the sky, a literal sea of alien DNA screaming toward the surface. Miller stood in the center of the bridge, his arms wide, his body acting as a lightning rod for a god. The violet fire hit him. He didn't burn. He expanded. His consciousness was flung across the globe, touching every echo, every infected machine, and every dying soul. He felt the entity's shock as he channeled the entire harvest into the dead, unmagnetized earth. Then the world went white. The white light did not bring peace, it brought a void. When the magnetic field of the earth flickered back into existence 10 seconds later, the world had been purged of its electric soul. The violet fire that had poured from the monoliths was gone, sucked into the crust of the planet through the living conduit that was Arthur Miller. But the cost was a global silence so absolute it felt like the weight of a mountain. In the ruins of the Ural Command Center, General Vance slumped against the cold concrete wall. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt hair. Opposite him, the body of General Volkov lay motionless. The violet glow in Volkov's eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind a husk of gray, brittle skin. The suicide switch had worked. By grounding the planet's magnetic field, they had burned out the alien signal, but they had also scorched the very foundations of human reach. Vance crawled to the shortwave radio. He turned the dial, but there was nothing. No static, no whispers, no Miller. The man who had been the bridge was gone, scattered into the atoms of the San Francisco fog. Vance looked at his own hands. They were shaking, but they were human. The silver veins had vanished. For the first time since 1962, the world was truly clean, but it was a cleanliness of the grave. 6 months passed. The black snow stopped falling, replaced by a gray, ash-heavy sleet that never seemed to end. The long winter had settled in. Without electricity, the survivors had retreated into small tribal enclaves, huddling around wood fires in the husks of dead cities. They were the unplugged. However, the threat had not vanished. It had merely changed its state. The alien DNA that Miller had grounded into the earth had not been destroyed. It had seeded. In the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the tundras of Siberia, a new kind of vegetation began to emerge. It was crystalline, translucent, and grew with a terrifying geometric precision. These glass forests didn't need sunlight. They fed on the residual radiation of the planet's core. Deep within one of these forests, near the site of the original San Francisco Bridge, a small group of scavengers made a discovery that would reignite the nightmare. They found a man. He was sitting in the center of a circle of violet crystals, his skin the color of polished chrome. He didn't breathe and his heart didn't beat, yet he was upright, his eyes fixed on the pale, gray sky. It was Miller, or what was left of him. He had become a living monument, a biological hard drive containing the entire sum of the harvest data that he had intercepted. He was no longer a man, but he was also the only library left of the world that had been. In the Urals, Vance had spent those months organizing a new military order, the Aegis. They were dedicated to one goal, ensuring the Frozen Protocol was never compromised again. They hunted the echoes that remained, the broken creatures that were now slowly reverting to feral, mindless beasts. But Vance knew the peace was a lie. He could feel a low-frequency vibration in the ground beneath his feet every night. The seeds were growing. "They aren't ships anymore, General," a young scout reported, standing in the dimly lit bunker office. "The monoliths that fell, they're hatching." Vance looked up from his maps. "Hatching? Explain." "The obsidian shells are cracking open, but nothing is coming out. Instead, they're drawing things in. They're acting like giant vacuum cleaners for organic matter. Trees, animals, even the soil, it's all being pulled into the shards." Vance realized the horror of their situation. The EMP and Miller's sacrifice had stopped the signal, but they had forced the entity to pivot to a purely biological, terrestrial invasion. The entity was no longer trying to control our machines, it was rebuilding its own ecology using our biomass. The glass forests were the lungs of a new organism, and Earth was the host being consumed from the inside out. The Aegis launched an expedition to find Miller. Vance believed that if they could extract the data from Miller's crystalline brain, they might find the kill code for the glass forests. It was a race against time. The forests were expanding at a rate of 5 miles a day, turning everything they touched into brittle violet shards. As the Aegis team approached the ruins of San Francisco, they realized they weren't the only ones looking for Miller. From the shadows of the Twisted Steel emerged a new faction, the Disciples of the Signal. These were survivors who hadn't been fully integrated but had been driven mad by the sudden silence of the blackout. They worshipped the entity as a god and saw Miller as a prophet who had stolen their heaven. The battle for the Chrome Man began in the heart of a glass forest. It was a war of Iron Age weapons and scavenged rifles against fanatics who fought with a suicidal frenzy. In the center of the chaos, Miller remained motionless, his silver eyes reflecting the violence around him. Suddenly Miller's hand moved. A pulse of pure, white energy rippled outward from his body, freezing everyone in their tracks. It wasn't an attack, it was a broadcast. For a brief second, everyone in the forest saw what Miller saw. They saw the guests not as invaders but as refugees. They saw a dying universe, a cold void where the entity's species had been hunted by something even more terrifying, something the entity had been trying to build a shield against using the Earth's resources. Miller's voice, 1,000 layers of sound, echoed through the trees. "You are building a wall against the dark, but you are building it with the bricks of your own children. The shield will not hold. The great hunger is coming." The Aegis soldiers and the disciples fell to their knees, clutching their heads. The vision was too much for the human mind to process. When the light faded, Miller was gone. In his place was a single, glowing violet seed, pulsating with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Vance, watching the feed from a remote camera, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter. He realized that Project Nebel was never about an invasion. It was a desperate, cosmic construction project. And the great hunger Miller mentioned was the reason the entity was so frantic to complete the harvest. "General," the scout whispered, looking at the screen, "if they were the refugees, what is the thing they are running from?" Vance didn't answer. He looked at the radar, which had finally started to work again. But it wasn't showing ships. It was showing a massive black shadow larger than the moon, entering the solar system. It wasn't broadcasting a signal. It was simply consuming the light of the stars as it moved. The frozen protocol was no longer enough. The world was cold, the machines were dead, and the builders were broken. And now, the true predator had finally arrived at the front door. The arrival of the Great Hunger changed the nature of the war. It was no longer a struggle between human and alien or steel and flesh. It was a race for survival against a void that didn't want to harvest Earth, but to erase it. The violet glass forests, once seen as an invasive plague, suddenly accelerated their growth, not as an act of aggression, but as a desperate attempt to armor the planet. The shadow entering the solar system was not a ship. It was a localized collapse of space-time, a celestial predator that the ancient texts of the entity called the Maw. As it passed the orbit of Saturn, the gas giant's rings were pulled out of alignment, spiraling into the blackness like dust into a vacuum. On Earth, the gravity began to fluctuate. The tides stopped following the moon, and the very air felt thin, as if the atmosphere was being sucked upward by an invisible straw. General Vance, inside the Aegis Command Center, watched the analog barometers drop to zero. The glass forests were now glowing with a frantic, pulsing intensity. They were no longer growing outward. They were growing upward, weaving together to form a crystalline canopy over the major continents. The entity was trying to build a planetary shell, a shield of biological diamond to protect its nursery from the coming erasure. "We are the insulation," Vance whispered, staring at the seismic readings. "The entity isn't saving us. It's using our world as a heat shield." In the ruins of San Francisco, the glowing seed that was once Arthur Miller began to sink into the earth. It traveled deep, past the crust, into the mantle where the grounded alien DNA had pooled. Miller's consciousness, now a vast digital ghost, realized that the planetary shield would fail if it remained a static structure. To survive the Maw, the Earth needed to become something it had never been: a conscious engine. Miller's voice reached out to the few remaining unplugged, who still carried trace amounts of the silver infection. He didn't send them visions of war, he sent them coordinates. He directed them to the old Project Nebel sites, the deep-sea trenches, the Siberian permafrost, and the Nevada desert. The shield needs a heart, Miller's thoughts echoed in their minds. The core must be ignited. At the Nevada site, a group of Aegis engineers, led by a former colleague of Dr. Aris, found the original Wraith drone prototypes. The machines were dead, but their frames were built from the alien superconductor. Following Miller's psychic blueprints, they began to dismantle the drones, using the parts to build a massive, crude induction coil around the mouth of the original vault shaft. They weren't building a weapon, they were building a spark plug for the planet. Vance, realizing that Miller's plan was the only hope, authorized the transfer of the last remaining nuclear fuel rods to the Nevada site. "If we ignite the mantle, we might blow the crust off the planet," Vance warned Volkov's empty chair. "But if we do nothing, there won't be a molecule of oxygen left in 10 hours. The Maw reached the orbit of Mars. The red planet didn't explode, it simply vanished, its mass consumed by the gravitational singularity. The sky over Earth turned a terrifying bruised black, and the sun began to look like a pale, flickering candle. The glass forests intensified their pulse, the violet light so bright it could be seen from the dark side of the moon. Miller, deep in the Earth's core, began to pull. He reached out to every echo still wandering the surface, every infected plant, and every silver-veined human. He asked for their energy, their heat, their very life force. It was the final harvest, but this time it was voluntary. One by one, the echoes stopped moving. They dissolved into puddles of blue mercury, which flowed into the cracks in the earth, racing toward the Nevada shaft. Now, Miller's voice screamed through the planet's crust. Vance triggered the ignition in Nevada. The nuclear fuel rods were dropped into the induction coil, creating a massive electromagnetic spike that traveled straight down the blue mercury vein into the heart of the Earth. The planet didn't shatter. Instead, it roared. A massive wave of geokinetic energy rippled outward from the core. The glass forests acted as the conductors, channeling the Earth's internal heat into the crystalline canopy. For a brief moment, the Earth was no longer a planet. It was a glowing violet sun, encased in a shell of diamond and fire. The maw hit the Earth's orbit. The collision was silent. Space itself warped and buckled against the violet shield. The crystalline canopy cracked, millions of tons of glass falling like meteors back to the surface, but the core held. The Earth was too hot, too dense with conscious energy for the singularity to swallow it whole. For 3 hours, the world was trapped in a gravitational tug-of-war. Mountains crumbled and oceans were displaced, but the nursery remained intact. The maw, unable to consume the ignited world, began to drift, pulled by the larger gravitational lure of the sun. When the darkness finally receded, the sky was no longer purple or black. It was a pale, washed-out blue. The glass forests were gone, shattered into a fine, glittering dust that covered the entire surface of the planet. The monoliths were empty husks, their energy spent. Vance stepped out of the Ural bunker. The air was cold, but it was fresh. He looked at the horizon and saw the dust reflecting the sunlight, creating a world that looked like it was made of pearls. "We survived," the scout whispered, leaning against the bunker door. "No," Vance said, looking at his hands, which were now completely clear of any silver. "We were spared. And the man who spared us is gone." Deep beneath the Nevada desert, the induction coil was a melted pile of slag. There was no sign of Miller, no sign of the seed. But if you put your ear to the ground, you could hear it, a low rhythmic thrumming like a heartbeat. The Earth was no longer just a rock in space. It was awake, and it was waiting for what came next. The frozen protocol was over. The age of the new Earth had begun. But in the deep void, where the maw continued its journey, a new signal was detected. The predator had failed, but the masters of the maw, the ones who had sent it, now knew exactly where we were. The year was now 1968, though the calendar felt like a relic of a lost civilization. The pearl dust that covered the Earth had created a permanent, shimmering twilight. Under this pale glow, the remnants of the Aegis and the surviving civilian enclaves began to rebuild. But they weren't building the world they had lost. They couldn't. The laws of physics had shifted. Gravity was inconsistent near the old Project Nebel sites, and the blue mercury veins in the Earth had become a primary energy source, harvested by those who still carried the Miller strain in their DNA. General Vance sat in a new command center, built not in a bunker, but in the open air of the Nevada desert, surrounded by pillars of glowing crystal. He was an old man now, his hair as white as the dust outside. He was no longer a general of an army, he was a curator of a dying species. Beside him stood a young woman named Elena, born in the first year of the blackout. She was one of the children of the dust. Her eyes were not brown or blue, but a shifting, iridescent silver. "The resonance is changing, General," Elena said, touching a smooth obsidian console that hummed under her fingers. "The Earth is no longer just breathing, screaming. It's sensing the architect's touch." Vance looked at the sky. Through the shimmering dust, he could see the faint, rhythmic blinking of stars that shouldn't be there. The masters of the maw had arrived in the solar system. They didn't come with ships or soldiers. They came with geometry. Massive, translucent shapes, tetrahedrons and spheres the size of small moons, were manifesting around the orbit of Jupiter. They were the architects of the original harvest, and they had come to reclaim their failed project. "They aren't here to eat us," Vance whispered. "They're here to reset the simulation." The architects viewed the Earth's newfound consciousness as a corruption of their design. To them, the Miller glitch was a cancer that had turned a simple resource-gathering mission into a rogue planetary intelligence. Their response was the zero-sum protocol. They began to broadcast a desequencing signal. a frequency designed to vibrate the pearl dust until it shattered the molecular bonds of everything it touched. Across the globe, the dust began to hiss. In the ruins of London and Tokyo, the shimmering layer of crystals started to vibrate with a high-pitched whine that drove animals into a frenzy. The Aegis enclaves reported that their structures were becoming brittle, turning into sand before their eyes. The very ground was beginning to dissolve. "Miller," Vance called out, looking down at the vibrating desert floor. "If you can hear me, we need the heart again." But Arthur Miller was no longer a singular mind. He had dissolved into the planet's core, his consciousness spread thin across the entire geosphere. He was the ghost in the Earth, and he was struggling to maintain his own coherence against the desequencing signal. The architects were deleting his memory, one layer of the crust at a time. Elena closed her eyes and pressed her palms into the dust. He's not responding because he's being overwritten. They are replacing his thoughts with their own code. We have to give him a focal point, a reason to stay human. The plan was a desperate act of psychic sabotage. Vance and Elena realized that the only way to stop the desequencing was to infect the architect's signal with a concentrated burst of human irrationality, the same weapon Miller had used in the hangar years ago. But this time it couldn't be one man's memory. It had to be the collective grief and hope of the entire species. Vance authorized the Project Echoback. They used the last of the blue mercury to power a massive array of acoustic mirrors built along the edge of the Nevada crater. These mirrors weren't designed to reflect light, but to amplify the psychic resonance of the survivors. Thousands of people were gathered at the site, instructed not to fight but to remember. They were told to focus on the things the architects could never understand: the feeling of a summer breeze, the taste of salt, the fear of death, and the illogical love for a broken world. As the desequencing signal reached its peak, and the desert began to liquefy into violet sludge, the echoback began. The collective consciousness of the survivors hit the architect's moon-sized shapes like a tidal wave of static. The sky didn't just vibrate, it bled colors that shouldn't exist. The tetrahedrons around Jupiter began to stutter, their perfect geometric lines blurring and warping. The desequencing signal broke. The pearl dust stopped hissing and settled into a calm, deep blue. For a moment there was a bridge. Through the echoback, the humans saw the architects. They weren't gods or even biological beings. They were ancient, automated systems, custodians of an aging universe, trying to keep everything orderly and efficient. They were as terrified of chaos as humans were of the dark. In that moment of connection, Miller's voice returned, booming from the very air they breathed. "They are not evil. They are just old, and they are afraid of the end. But the end is where the story begins." Using the surge of energy from the echoback, Miller did the unthinkable. He didn't push the architects away. He uploaded the human experience into their central processors. He gave the custodians a soul, and with it, he gave them the capacity for sorrow. The massive geometric shapes stopped their descent. One by one, they began to fold into themselves, shrinking until they were no larger than a grain of sand, and then they vanished. They didn't flee, they went silent, processing the impossible data of what it meant to be alive and mortal. The silence that followed was different from the blackout. It was a peaceful silence. The desequencing had stopped, and the pearl dust began to glow with a soft, warm amber light. The long winter was finally ending. The sun broke through the crystalline haze for the first time in years, casting long golden shadows across the Nevada sand. Vance looked at Elena. Her silver eyes were fading, returning to a human brown. The Miller strain was receding, leaving them as they were before the Goliath vanished in 1962. "Is it over?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "The war is over," Vance said, sitting down on a piece of weathered obsidian. "But the world we knew is gone. We're standing on a new shore now." As they watched the sunset, the ground gave one final, gentle thrum. It was a goodbye. Arthur Miller, the bridge and the ghost, had finally let go. He had used the last of his energy to ferry the architects away, and in doing so, he had truly become part of the Earth's silence. But as the stars came out, Vance noticed something. One star, the one that had been the center of the architect's fleet, was still there. It wasn't a ship and it wasn't a master. It was a beacon. A door had been left open. The frozen protocol was gone, and the nursery was finally ready to look at the rest of the garden. The golden age of the amber twilight did not last. While the architects had been pacified by the upload of human experience, the bridge that Arthur Miller created had left a vacuum in the cosmic hierarchy. The Earth was no longer a hidden nursery. It was a lighthouse in a universe filled with ancient, starving shadows. The beacon left in the sky was not just a door for us to look out, it was a doorway for things that had been waiting in the outer void for eons. By 1970, the world had settled into a fragile agrarian peace. The pearl dust had integrated into the soil, creating crops that grew with an eerie bioluminescent glow, ending the threat of famine. But the military remnants of the Aegis, led by a weary Silas Vance, knew that the silence was deceptive. The blue mercury veins beneath the crust were no longer stagnant. They were flowing with an accelerated velocity, as if the Earth itself was preparing for a massive physiological shift. Vance spent his days in the Nevada Command Center, watching the void scanners, primitive but effective devices that measured the density of space-time around the beacon. For 2 years, the beacon had been a steady white light. But on the morning of the spring equinox, it turned a deep, obsidian black. It wasn't just a change in color, it was an inversion of light. The beacon had become a gravity well, pulling the surrounding starlight into a swirling vortex. "It's not a message anymore," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the monitors. She had lost her silver iris, but she had retained a phantom sense, a residual ability to feel the shifts in the planet's magnetic field. "The door isn't just open. Something is pushing through from the other side. Something that doesn't want to harvest us. It wants to replace the vacuum." The threat this time was the entropic swarm. In the cold regions beyond the architect's reach lived entities of pure antimatter, remnants of a universe that had died before ours was even born. They were attracted to the Miller glitch because it was the most concentrated source of life entropy in the galaxy. To them, the Earth was a pulsating heart in a graveyard, and they were the scavengers of reality. As the black vortex in the sky expanded, the Earth's rotation began to slow. Days became 30 hours long, then 40. The amber twilight vanished, replaced by a terrifying solar eclipse that didn't end. The temperature plummeted. The bioluminescent crops withered and turned into black glass. The long winter was returning, but this time it was accompanied by the Reapers of the Void. Small, shadow-like fissures began to open across the planet's surface. They didn't appear in the cities, but in the places of deep emotional resonance. Cemeteries, old battlefields, and the sites of the original Project Nebel excavations. From these fissures emerged the hollows, shadowy bipedal forms that had no mass, no heat, and no sound. They didn't kill with blades or fire, they killed by erasing. If a hollow touched you, you didn't die, you simply ceased to have ever existed. Your memories, your impact on the world, and your very DNA were scrubbed from the timeline. Vance watched in horror as his own soldiers vanished from the monitors. One moment a guard was standing at the gate. The next, there was only an empty uniform and a world that didn't remember his name. "The frozen protocol cannot stop this," Vance whispered, his voice trembling. "How do you fight something that deletes the past?" Elena looked at the blue mercury reserves. They were glowing with a frantic, rhythmic pulse. "We don't fight it with the past, General. We fight it with the future constant. Miller didn't just leave us a memory. He left us a blueprint." She led Vance to the deepest level of the Nevada facility, to a chamber that had been sealed since the Ecobac incident. In the center of the room sat a device that looked like a massive silver chrysalis. It was built from the remains of the original Wraith drones and the blue mercury that Miller had grounded into the crust. "This is the Kronos anchor," Elena explained. Miller knew the entropic swarm would come. He knew the architects were just the gatekeepers. This device is designed to lock the Earth's current state into a permanent loop, a time crystalline shell. It will make us untouchable to the hollows because our existence will become a fixed point that cannot be erased. But there was a catch. To activate the Kronos anchor, someone had to step inside the chrysalis and act as the observer. They would have to witness every moment of human history simultaneously, holding the entire timeline in their mind to prevent the swarm from unraveling it. It was a task that would burn out a human brain in seconds. "I'll do it," Vance said, stepping forward. He was old, and he was the last man who remembered the world before the Goliath. He was the anchor of the old world. "No," a voice echoed through the chamber. It wasn't Miller's voice, but it was familiar. It was the entity that had worn Miller's face, still trapped in the subterranean cell where Miller had left it years ago. It had survived on the residual energy of the blue mercury, becoming a withered, translucent thing. "You are a creature of the past, Vance," the entity rasped, its cage glowing with a dim violet light. "The swarm will eat your memories of war and regret. But I am a creature of this system. I have no memories to erase. I have only the code. I am the bridge that Miller broke, and I am the only one who can hold the anchor." Vance looked at the creature. It had been their greatest enemy, the architect of their initial destruction. But in the face of total erasure, even a monster could be a shield. "Why help us?" Vance asked. "Because if the swarm erases this world, I cease to exist as well," the entity replied. "I do not seek redemption. I seek persistence. Let me into the machine, and I will turn this planet into a fortress of time." The Hollows were now at the gates of the Nevada facility. The air was screaming as the vacuum of the swarm began to pull at the very molecules of the base. Vance looked at Elena, then at the creature. With a heavy heart, he turned the key to the entity's cell. The entity didn't attack. It drifted toward the chrysalis, its metallic skin shimmering one last time. It stepped into the machine and the silver doors hissed shut. The Kronos anchor roared to life. A wave of time pressure rippled outward from Nevada. It wasn't a pulse of light, but a pulse of certainty. As the wave hit the hollows, they didn't explode. They simply slid off the reality of the world like water off a duck's back. They couldn't erase what was now a fixed, crystalline constant. In the sky, the black vortex hit the Earth's atmosphere and shattered. The antimatter was neutralized by the sheer density of the Earth's existence. The swarm, finding a world that was now a temporal monolith, moved on, seeking easier prey in the dark. The Earth was saved again, but it was now locked. We were no longer part of the universal timeline. We were a stasis world. The stars in the sky stopped moving. The seasons stopped changing. We were safe, but we were frozen in a perpetual moment of 1970. Vance stepped out into the Nevada night. The moon was fixed in the sky, a permanent silver guardian. The air was still. The long winter had been replaced by the eternal now. "We are safe," Elena whispered, looking at the frozen stars. "But at what cost?" Vance asked. "We've won the war against erasure, but we've lost the right to grow. We are a museum now, Elena. A museum of the human race." Deep inside the Kronos anchor, the entity sat in the dark, its mind holding the weight of 1 billion years. It was the warden of our cage and the protector of our soul. And as it watched the frozen timeline, it noticed a tiny flickering light at the very edge of the future. A light that suggested the locked world was not the end, but a cocoon. By 1975, the stasis sickness had become the primary threat to the remnants of humanity. Without the natural progression of time, the biological drive to innovate and survive was fading. People sat in the ruins of their cities, staring at the frozen stars, their minds slipping into a collective lethargy. General Silas Vance, now a frail shadow of the man who had faced the Goliath, realized that the temporal monolith was not a fortress but a tomb. "The anchor is holding the world too tight, Elena," Vance whispered in the dim light of the Nevada Command Center. "We aren't being erased by the swarm, but we are being erased by ourselves. If we don't break the shell, there won't be anyone left to remember why we built it." Elena, who had spent years monitoring the hum of the silver chrysalis, looked at the readings. The entity inside the anchor was no longer just a warden. It was merging with the Earth's core. The blue mercury veins were turning into time filaments, weaving through the crust and into the very cells of every living thing. The entity was trying to maintain the fixed point, but the pressure of the external universe, the outer dark, was beginning to cause cracks in the crystalline reality. "The swarm didn't leave, General," Elena said, her voice trembling. "They are just waiting at the edge of the bubble. They are like wolves circling a fire that's running out of wood. And the fire is the entity's will." Suddenly, the ground shook, not with a tectonic tremor but with a frequency shift. The sky, which had been a constant, pale blue, flickered into a deep, bruised violet for a fraction of a second. The stasis was breaking. Inside the chrysalis, the entity was screaming. The burden of holding the entire human timeline was too great. The code was fracturing under the weight of human grief and the sheer complexity of our chaotic history. A fissure opened in the center of the Nevada facility, and from it emerged a time wraith, a distorted, shimmering version of Captain Arthur Miller. This wasn't the Chrome Man or the ghost in the Earth. This was a fragment of Miller's consciousness that had been trapped in the folds of the anchor. He looked at Vance with eyes that contained the birth and death of sons. "The anchor is a cage, Silas," the Wraith Miller said, his voice echoing from every corner of the room. "The harvest was about consumption. The swarm was about erasure. But the next phase is the melding. The architects are returning, but they are no longer the custodians. They have been changed by the data I gave them. They have learned to feel, and now they want to hone that." The beacon in the sky, which had been a black hole of gravity, suddenly exploded into a rainbow of fractal light. The architect's moon-sized shapes manifested once more, but they were no longer cold geometry. They were fluid, shifting forms of light and sound. They didn't fire desequencing signals. They broadcast a call. They were inviting the Earth to leave the physical dimension entirely. They wanted to transition the entire planet into a high-tech ether, a realm where the blue mercury and human consciousness could exist without the threat of entropy or erasure. It was the ultimate evolution, but it required the total destruction of the physical Earth. They want us to shed our skins, Elena realized, tears streaming down her face. They want to turn us into pure information. A world of ghosts in a digital heaven. Vance gripped his cane. And what happens to the Earth? To the dirt? To the memories of the wind? It burns, Silas, the Miller Wraith replied. The physical shell must be discarded for the soul to fly. That is the price of the melding. The Aegis enclaves were divided. Some, driven mad by the stasis sickness, welcomed the melding. They ran toward the glass forests, which had begun to grow again, their crystalline branches reaching for the fractal light in the sky. Others, led by Vance, refused to give up the material truth. They believed that to be human was to be tied to the dust, the struggle, and the cold. The final conflict of Project Nebel began not as a war of missiles, but as a war of resonance. The architects began to pull on the souls of the survivors, using the silver infection as a magnetic tether. People began to fade, their bodies turning into shimmering pillars of light before vanishing into the sky. Vance realized that he had one final card to play. He had to use the frozen protocol one last time, but not to freeze the planet. He had to use it to overload the anchor. If he could trigger a massive surge of linear time through the blue mercury veins, he could ground the planet back into the physical dimension so deeply that even the architects couldn't pull it away. But it would mean the death of the entity, the death of Miller's ghost, and the permanent loss of the blue mercury energy. The Earth would return to 1962, a world of gunpowder, oil, and nuclear shadows. The magic would be gone. The high-tech dream would end. We will be alone again, Vance said, his hand over the overload switch. No more ghosts, no more gods. Just us in the dark with our mistakes. Do it, the Miller Wraith whispered, his form beginning to dissolve into the fractal light. Give them back their gravity. Give them back their death. It's the only thing that makes them real. Vance looked at Elena. She nodded, her hand over his. Together they threw the switch. The Kronos anchor didn't explode, it imploded. A wave of absolute reality surged outward from Nevada. The fractal light in the sky shattered like glass. The architect's shapes recoiled, their ether rejected by the sudden, violent density of the Earth. The glass forests turned to sand in a heartbeat. The pillars of light carrying the souls of the vanished were cut short, the people falling back to the Earth, gasping for air, their silver eyes turning brown. The entity inside the chrysalis let out one final haunting chord of music before it vanished into dust. The blue mercury in the veins turned into inert, gray lead. The eternal now was broken. Vance stepped out into the Nevada desert. For the first time in 13 years, the stars were moving. The moon was setting. The sun was rising, not with an amber glow, but with the harsh, yellow light of a desert morning. He looked at his watch. The second hand began to tick. 1, 2, 3. Time is moving, Elena said, her voice small and fragile. Yes, Vance replied. And we are old. And we are tired. And we are human. The Project Nebel files were officially closed. The world returned to its maps, its borders, and its wars. The Goliath was forgotten. The Chrome Man became a legend told by old men in bars. But deep beneath the crust, in the silent, gray veins of the Earth, a single spark of violet light remained, a seed waiting for the next time humanity forgot the cost of its success. The morning of January 1st, 1976, felt like the first real day in human history. The fractal light was gone. The blue mercury was dead lead. The Earth had been grounded back into the heavy, unforgiving laws of physics. Across the globe, people stood in the wreckage of a decade they barely remembered, feeling the weight of their own bones for the first time in years. The great silence had returned, but it wasn't the silence of the void. It was the silence of a world that had been given a second chance to fail on its own terms. General Silas Vance spent his final days in a small farmhouse in Virginia, far from the concrete tombs of Nevada. He sat on his porch watching the sunset, a normal orange sunset that didn't pulse or hum. Beside him lay a stack of yellowed documents, the original files of Project Nebel. He had spent months trying to write the true history of the Goliath, the Chrome Man, and the architects, but the words felt hollow. How do you describe the color of a soul being uploaded to the stars? How do you explain that the world was once a nursery for gods? In Washington, the new administration had classified everything. The blackout was officially recorded as a decade-long atmospheric anomaly caused by unprecedented solar flares and a series of secret high-altitude nuclear tests. The Echoes, who hadn't reverted to human form, were quietly moved to underground facilities, where they were studied by men in white coats who had never heard of the Miller glitch. The military-industrial complex was already looking for the next ghost tech, unaware that they had burned the only bridge to the stars. Elena, the girl with the phantom sense, visited Vance one last time. She was no longer a silver-eyed child of the dust. She was a woman of 25, working as a junior librarian at the Library of Congress. She didn't have her psychic visions anymore, but she still felt a strange pressure in her ears whenever she walked over a fault line. "Is it truly gone, Silas?" she asked, looking at the peaceful Virginia hills. "The entity Miller? The whole nightmare?" Vance lit a pipe, the smoke curling in the cool air. "The technology is gone, Elena. The power we didn't earn is gone. But the universe doesn't forget a planet that shouted into the dark. We are like a house that was once haunted. The ghosts may have moved on, but the walls still remember the screams." He was right. While the frozen protocol had succeeded in severing the tether, the earth had been changed. The pearl dust had enriched the soil in ways that science couldn't explain. The plants were hardier, the air was cleaner, and the children born after the melding were smarter, more intuitive, as if the human race had received a biological upgrade before the door slammed shut. We were alone, but we were better. Deep beneath the Nevada desert, in the ruins of the vault, a team of young engineers was clearing the rubble. They found the remains of the Kronos anchor, a melted, blackened shell of silver and lead. They assumed it was a piece of failed Soviet espionage or a discarded rocket engine. They didn't see the faint, microscopic glow coming from the very bottom of the shaft. They didn't see the single, translucent crystal growing out of the rock, vibrating at a frequency that no human ear could hear. The story of Project Nebel is a warning. It tells us that success has a cost, and that progress is often just a prettier word for an invasion. We reached for the stars and found that the stars were reaching back, hungry for our chaos. We fought a war against erasure, a war against stasis, and a war against our own ambition. And in the end, we won by choosing to be mortal. General Vance died in his sleep later that year. In his hand was a small, smooth piece of obsidian, the last shard of the original cavern walls. He died knowing that the secret was safe, buried under layers of bureaucracy and the relentless march of linear time. But he also died knowing that the Goliath wasn't the last ship that would go missing in the dark. The file is closed. The protocol is frozen. But remember, the next time you see a flicker in the night sky that doesn't move like a star, or hear a hum in the static of your radio that sounds like a heartbeat, don't look for a logical explanation. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the ice. Some wars are fought in the shadows so the rest of us can live in the light. This is the end of the classified files of Eldermurk. The truth is often more terrifying than the fiction we are fed. If you've followed us through the frozen wastes, the Nevada vaults, and the crystalline forests of the future, then you know that the real history of our world is written in the blood of those who dared to look into the abyss. The archives of Eldermurk are vast, and there are many more secrets waiting to be unearthed. From the depths of the ocean to the silent reaches of the moon, the Shadow War continues. If you want to be the first to know when the next protocol is activated, you know what to do. Subscribe to Eldermurk. Join the ranks of those who refuse to look away. Like this broadcast to signal your clearance and share your theories in the comments below. Did Vance make the right choice, or did we just delay the inevitable harvest? The eye is always watching. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and most importantly, stay in the shadows.